The unexpected encounter. The sound of shattered glass broke through the silence of the top floor as Richard Harrington, CEO of Harrington Global, slammed a crystal tumbler against the wall. Scotch streaked down the mahogany paneling like slow, amber tears, and his reflection in the window, a powerful man with gray at his temples and exhaustion in his eyes, stared back like an accusation. The city below pulsed with life, but inside that glass fortress everything felt dead. His company's billion-dollar merger had just collapsed because of one mistranslated clause in a foreign contract. One line, one word, had cost him everything he'd worked decades for. He paced the darkened office, rage burning behind his ribs. "How the hell do you lose a deal over language?" he muttered. The staff had all gone home. Only the cleaning crew lingered somewhere on the lower floors. He loosened his tie and sank into the leather chair, the smell of liquor and rain mixing in the air. A storm was coming. He could see lightning crawl across the skyline, and somehow it matched the fury inside him. Then he heard it. From the corridor beyond his door came a voice, steady, low, and calm, speaking in perfect French. The tone wasn't casual or broken, but fluent, refined, almost poetic. Richard froze. The words drifted closer as if carried by the hum of the air conditioning. "Je comprends votre frustration, mais la vérité demande du courage." "I understand your frustration, but truth demands courage." He frowned. Who the hell was speaking French in his building at midnight? He stood, walked to the doorway, and leaned out just enough to see the reflection of a man in the glass wall opposite. It was the janitor, Miguel Alvarez, mopping the marble floor outside the executive offices. Miguel's dark hair was streaked with silver, his posture humble, his uniform worn. He held an old phone to his ear, still speaking in flawless French. Then without pause, he switched to German, responding to what sounded like another caller. The transition was so smooth it didn't seem human, his accent crisp, his diction precise. Richard blinked, disbelieving. He waited, silent, as Miguel moved toward the elevator. Just before the doors closed, a woman's voice called out from the reception desk in Japanese. Miguel turned and replied fluently, bowing slightly, his tone respectful, confident, natural. The elevator doors slid shut, and silence returned, leaving Richard staring at the empty hallway, heart pounding like he'd seen a ghost. He knew talent when he heard it. He'd built empires on spotting it, but this didn't fit anywhere in his world. A janitor who spoke like a diplomat, who shifted from French to German to Japanese as easily as breathing. It made no sense. He sank back into his chair, curiosity cutting through his anger. His father's voice came back to him from decades ago, gravelly and proud. "The most dangerous people are the ones you underestimate." That night, Richard couldn't sleep. He sat in his penthouse staring at the ceiling while rain hammered against the windows. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard that calm voice again, those languages flowing together like rivers. He started to wonder who Miguel really was. The man had been working there for almost 5 years, invisible as the furniture, polite but reserved, never asking for favors or raises. And yet, beneath that quiet surface, something was hiding. Something powerful, disciplined, dangerous even. The next morning, Richard came in early. He found Miguel polishing the brass handles of the main lobby doors. "Morning, sir," Miguel said with his usual soft smile. Richard nodded, studying him. "Morning. Long night?" Miguel shrugged. "Just another one." His tone was modest, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of old sorrow, maybe a memory he wished he could erase. Richard almost asked about the languages, but pride held his tongue. Instead, he lingered nearby, pretending to check his phone. A group of visiting consultants entered. One of them, a woman from Paris, dropped her coffee cup and muttered in French. Without hesitation, Miguel responded, soothing her with perfect fluency. She laughed, surprised, and asked if he had lived in France. Miguel only smiled and said, "Once upon a time." The phrase struck Richard harder than he expected. Once upon a time. It sounded like a man who'd lost an entire life and buried it under silence. He spent the rest of the day distracted, watching Miguel from his office window. When an IT technician from Berlin asked for help locating a lost drive, Miguel answered him, in German. Later, he helped the catering staff by reading a note written in Japanese. Each time, he did it naturally, never drawing attention to himself, never boasting. By evening, Richard had made up his mind. He called his assistant. "Get me the file on Miguel Alvarez. All records, background checks, everything. Tonight." When the report arrived, it was disturbingly thin. No college education, no certifications, no foreign employment records, nothing before arriving in the U.S. 10 years ago. It was as if Miguel Alvarez had been born the day he applied for that janitorial job. Richard sat back, unsettled. The air outside his office felt charged, the kind of tension that comes before a lightning strike. He didn't know it yet, but that night, listening to a janitor speak 9 languages, was the moment his world began to unravel. What he'd uncovered wasn't just a man cleaning floors. It was a ghost from another life, carrying secrets that would soon shake every wall of his empire. And Richard Harrington, a man who had spent his life mastering control, had just stepped into a story far larger and far more dangerous than he could imagine. The hidden past. Curiosity turns obsession. For the next several days, Richard Harrington found himself haunted by the sound of that calm, multilingual voice. It echoed through his thoughts even during meetings, creeping between words of balance sheets and strategy forecasts. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was an itch under his skin. A man like Miguel Alvarez didn't belong invisible in a place like Harrington Global, not with a mind like that. Richard had spent years studying human patterns, evaluating talent, dissecting people like blueprints, and this one didn't fit any known design. One night, long after the building had emptied again, Richard stayed back under the excuse of paperwork. But in truth, he was watching. He dimmed the lights in his office and waited until the soft, rhythmic hum of a mop echoed across the polished floors. Miguel was alone, headphones dangling loosely from his collar, humming a tune that sounded faintly Spanish yet ancient, almost a lullaby. Then the phone buzzed in his pocket, and Miguel answered, switching tongues effortlessly to what Richard identified as Arabic. The cadence was smooth, almost musical. Richard stepped out silently. "Long night?" he asked, making Miguel startle slightly before smiling. "Mr. Harrington, I didn't see you there. Just finishing up." Richard tilted his head. "You speak Arabic?" Miguel hesitated, caught between truth and silence. "A little," he said. "A little?" Richard pressed, pretending amusement. "Because what I just heard wasn't a little. It was perfect." Miguel's eyes flickered, a crack of discomfort passing through his calm exterior. "Languages are like tools, sir," he said carefully. "Sometimes you collect them without meaning to." Richard chuckled, but inside his pulse quickened. That line wasn't random, without meaning to. Nobody just collected 9 languages. "Interesting," Richard replied, pretending to lose interest. "You ever think of using those tools for something more than cleaning offices?" Miguel smiled faintly. "I did once." There it was again, that quiet sentence, heavy as a confession. "I did once." After Miguel left, Richard walked the empty halls, the fluorescent lights humming above him. He passed framed portraits of himself shaking hands with world leaders and CEOs, but tonight they all felt hollow. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or quarterly reports. He was thinking about one man who carried the weight of mystery like a hidden scar. The next day, he summoned his head of security. "Pull every employment record on Miguel Alvarez, prior addresses, visas, travel history, anything." The results that came back were unsettling. Miguel had no digital footprint before arriving in New York 10 years ago. His social security number was legitimate but recently issued. His immigration file showed a visa from Spain, though the embassy's watermark was slightly faded, almost too faded. Richard's instincts sharpened. Something had been erased, deliberately. That night, while most of the city slept under sheets of rain, Richard couldn't help himself. He went down to the basement, where the janitorial crew kept their lockers. Only Miguel's was neatly organized, Uniform pressed, shoes polished, and inside a small tin box wrapped in faded blue cloth. Richard hesitated, guilt prickling his conscience, but curiosity won. He opened it carefully. Inside were old yellowed documents written in Cyrillic, a passport without a photo, and a child's drawing of a family, a man, woman, and small boy holding hands under a flag he didn't recognize. Lightning flashed through the small basement window, and for a moment Richard saw his reflection beside the ghost of another man's pain. He put everything back exactly as it was, but his hands trembled. He realized he hadn't felt this alive, or this unsure, in years. The following morning, Richard tried to act normal, but the weight of what he'd seen gnawed at him. During a coffee break, he noticed Miguel reading an old paperback novel written in Russian. Richard seized the moment. "You read that language too?" he asked casually. Miguel closed the book, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes stories are easier to bear in another tongue," he said quietly. That line hit Richard deeper than expected. It wasn't arrogance. It was pain disguised as wisdom. Something in Miguel's voice carried the fatigue of a man who had lived too many lives and buried them all. Later that week, Richard arranged a surprise language test, disguised as a company cultural appreciation event. Employees were invited to greet one another in different languages. When Miguel effortlessly handled greetings in Mandarin, Portuguese, Russian, and Swahili, the room fell silent. Jaws dropped. Laughter turned to disbelief. One executive whispered, "He's like a walking translation engine." But Richard didn't laugh. He watched Miguel's eyes, saw the unease behind his calm. After the event, Richard caught up to him. "You could work anywhere, you know that? You could make 6 figures in my translation department alone." Miguel gave a small, tired smile. "Money isn't freedom, Mr. Harrington. Sometimes it's just another kind of prison." Richard froze at the words. They sounded personal, not philosophical. He wanted to ask, "Who imprisoned you?" But Miguel's expression had already closed. The conversation was over. That night, while Richard drove home through the pouring rain, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had stumbled upon something far darker than a gifted janitor. The man's composure wasn't confidence. It was survival. His silence wasn't shyness. It was protection. And those missing years, that blank space in his life, were beginning to look less like coincidence and more like a deliberate erasure. For the first time, Richard wasn't sure if his curiosity was leading him to a revelation or a danger he wasn't ready to face. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, headlights cutting through the storm, as a thought whispered at the back of his mind like a warning. Sometimes the people who hide the most are the ones you should fear the least, or the most. And somewhere behind him, in the deserted building, Miguel stood alone by the window, watching the lightning over the city, murmuring in a language Richard had never heard before, a language that sounded less like words and more like mourning. The revelation, the truth beneath the silence. The storm returned 3 nights later, furious and relentless, as if the city itself wanted to tear open its secrets. Rain hammered against the skyscraper's glass walls and thunder rolled like distant cannon fire. Most employees had fled early to avoid the flooding streets, but 2 lights still burned inside Harrington Global, one in the CEO's office, and another in the janitor's closet 3 floors down. Richard Harrington sat by the window, sleeves rolled up, the glow of his laptop casting hard shadows across his face. He wasn't working on contracts anymore. He was scrolling through encrypted databases, embassy lists, and old newspaper archives, chasing a ghost through digital smoke. Every search for Miguel Alvarez led nowhere, but a cross-match of the passport number he'd seen on those faded documents turned up something that made his chest tighten. The name wasn't Miguel Alvarez at all. It was Mikhail Androv, once a celebrated linguist and interpreter for the International Peace Commission in Eastern Europe, declared missing during a civil war 12 years ago, suspected of espionage, accused of selling classified information that led to dozens of deaths. Richard's hand froze on the mouse. Espionage. The word felt poisonous. He stared at the screen, reading the old article twice. Mikhail's photo, younger, cleaner shaven, but unmistakably Miguel, stared back at him from the pixelated image. "Holy hell," Richard whispered. His mind spun. Had he hired a fugitive? A spy hiding under a new name? He leaned back, heartbeat pounding. Logic told him to call security, to alert authorities, but instinct, something deeper, held him still. The man he'd seen these past weeks wasn't a threat. He was something else. Haunted, yes. Broken, maybe. But dangerous? Richard wasn't sure anymore. As thunder cracked overhead, the building lights flickered and went out, plunging the floor into sudden darkness. Richard swore softly, grabbed his phone for a flashlight, and stepped into the hallway. The emergency lights hummed weakly, washing everything in ghostly red. Somewhere below, he heard footsteps and the metallic clang of a bucket tipping over. He followed the sound down to the lower floor. Miguel, no answer. Only the wind moaning through the stairwell. Then from the maintenance lounge, a faint flicker of candlelight glowed. He pushed the door open quietly and froze. Miguel sat at a small table, a single candle burning beside an open box. The same blue cloth-wrapped tin. Spread before him were photographs, not just of a family but of devastation. Ruins, burned-out vehicles, refugee camps. Richard's eyes caught one photo in particular, a woman and child, faces smudged by ash, standing beside a military checkpoint. The woman's eyes mirrored Miguel's. Miguel looked up, calm but weary. "You shouldn't be here, sir." Richard hesitated. "I could say the same about you. Or should I say, Mikhail Androv?" Silence. The candle flame trembled. For a long moment, neither man spoke, and the storm filled the space between them. Finally, Miguel exhaled, shoulders lowering as if releasing a decade of burden. "You found it," Richard nodded slowly. "You were a linguist, a peace negotiator. Then you disappeared." Miguel's gaze dropped to the table. Disappeared is one word for it. Erased might be closer. He gestured to the photo of the woman and child. "My wife Elena, my son David. They were taken the day before everything collapsed. I was accused of betraying my own people, of selling information that led to a massacre. Lies, but in war, truth dies first. When I refused to sign their confession, they came for my family. I never saw them again." Richard stood still, the story cutting through him like broken glass. "So you ran." "I survived," Miguel said quietly. "I escaped with a false passport and a different name. Every country I crossed, I picked up another language, another disguise, until words themselves became my shield. Every tongue I spoke was one more way to hide." Lightning illuminated the room, and for a moment Richard saw not a janitor but a man carved by loss, surviving on fragments of the person he once was. "You could have started over," Richard said, voice low. "Why come here?" Miguel smiled faintly, but it wasn't joy. "Because this is where people stop asking questions. In places of power, the invisible man is safest. No one looks at the janitor." Richard sat across from him, the truth sinking in. "And all this time you've been cleaning our floors while we step over you." Miguel's eyes met his. "Everyone's cleaning something, Mr. Harrington. You just use better polish." The words hit harder than intended. Richard looked away, ashamed of how true they felt. His own life, the cold mansion, the broken marriage, the estranged son he hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly looked like another form of exile. A distant rumble echoed through the building as if the storm had settled inside their chests. "You could go back," Richard said. "Clear your name." Miguel shook his head. "To whom? The people who destroyed it? No, some truths don't need clearing, and they just need surviving." They sat in silence, two men bound by different prisons, one built by lies, the other by pride. When the lights flickered back on, Miguel began packing the photos away. "You'll need to decide what to do now," he said. "Report me or forget this conversation." Richard didn't answer. He walked to the door, paused, then turned. "I've made my share of mistakes, Miguel. But letting the wrong man stay invisible won't be one of them." Miguel looked up, something unreadable in his expression. Suspicion, maybe hope. "Then you're a rare man, Mr. Harrington. Most people only see what their comfort allows." Richard left without another word, but his thoughts were a storm of their own. For the first time in years, he felt the raw pulse of purpose. Not to control, but to understand. And yet beneath that growing empathy lurked another feeling entirely, dread, because deep down, he sensed that Miguel's past hadn't just followed him across borders. It was still out there, alive, waiting for its unfinished revenge. Outside, the thunder roared one final time, echoing across the skyline like a warning. And in the flickering candlelight, Miguel closed his eyes and whispered something in Russian, a prayer or perhaps a promise, before the flame went out. The test, redemption or exploitation? By the time dawn broke over Manhattan, the storm had passed, but the tension in Richard Harrington's office felt heavier than ever. The revelation about Mikhail, had rewritten every assumption Richard had about power, loyalty, and truth. The man he'd once overlooked was now a living enigma sitting quietly 3 floors below him, carrying the kind of story that could shatter reputations and save souls in the same breath. That morning, Richard faced another storm, this one inside the boardroom. The company's quarterly losses were on the table and his investors wanted blood. "We need to cut expenses by at least 20%, barked John Kavanaugh, the CFO, his tone clipped and ruthless. "Start with non-essential staff, maintenance, janitorial, cafeteria. These roles can be outsourced." The words made Richard's jaw tighten. He saw Miguel's face in his mind, the quiet dignity, the candlelight on those weathered hands. "Outsourced, erased again." "Absolutely not," Richard said sharply. Heads turned. "We'll cut executive bonuses before we touch the lower staff." A murmur swept through the room. Kavanaugh sneered. "That's noble, Richard, but impractical. You're talking about saving people who mop floors while risking the confidence of shareholders." Richard leaned forward, voice calm but dangerous. "The people who mop floors are the ones who make it possible for you to sit in that chair without stepping in your own mess. Remember that." The room went silent. But beneath the surface, rebellion brewed. Kavanaugh smirked. "You sound sentimental, Richard." "That's not like you." "What's changed?" Richard didn't answer, but inside he knew. Something had shifted since the night he'd seen Miguel's hidden world. The weight of the man's silence had infected him, forced him to see his own empire's blindness. Still, he couldn't reveal the truth. Not yet. Later that afternoon, fate delivered him a test more dangerous than any merger. A European investor group, French and German representatives, had arrived unexpectedly to renegotiate a collapsed deal. Their interpreter had canceled last minute. Panic rippled through the office. "Should we postpone?" asked his assistant. Richard's mind flashed to Miguel. "No," he said. "We'll find someone in-house." Before anyone could question it, he strode down to the lower floors. Miguel was buffing the marble near the elevators when Richard appeared. "I need you upstairs now." Miguel looked up, startled. "Sir? You speak French, German, Japanese, probably half a dozen others. I have a meeting that needs all 3. Can you handle it?" Miguel hesitated. "That's not my job." "Maybe not," Richard replied, lowering his voice, "but it's your chance to start rewriting your story." For a moment, their eyes locked. Something unspoken passed between them. Trust, risk, maybe redemption. Miguel wiped his hands, straightened his uniform, and followed Richard upstairs. When the meeting began, the investors greeted Richard coldly. "Your company cost us millions," one said in French. "We should not even be here." Before Richard could respond, Miguel stepped forward, translating flawlessly, not just words, but tone, rhythm, emotion. He shifted languages like a conductor guiding an orchestra, bridging gaps that no interpreter's script could cover. The investors began to lean in, intrigued, even impressed. One German delegate asked a technical question. Miguel translated with such precision and confidence that the man smiled for the first time. The atmosphere softened. Deals once thought dead began to thaw, but not everyone in the room was pleased. From the corner, Kavanaugh's eyes narrowed. He recognized Miguel and whispered to a board member, "Why the hell is the janitor in here?" When the meeting ended in tentative success, applause rippled through the room. Richard turned to Miguel. "Well done." But outside, in the corridor, the air turned poisonous. Kavanaugh was waiting. "What kind of stunt was that?" he snapped. "Bringing the cleaning staff to a high-level meeting? Have you lost your mind?" Richard glared at him. "That man just saved a $50 million deal." Kavanaugh laughed harshly. "That man? You mean the ghost you hired from nowhere? You have no idea who he really is, do you? We did some digging after your little display of charity. His papers are fake. He's not even who he says he is." Richard's blood ran cold. "You what?" Kavanaugh leaned closer, voice a venomous whisper. Interpol flagged his name. "There's a red notice from 12 years ago. Espionage, treason, something about stolen documents." "Congratulations, Richard, you just made a fugitive your translator." The world seemed to tilt. You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, Kavanaugh interrupted. You're compromised. If the press gets wind of this, you're finished. Maybe that's why he's here, to finish what he started overseas. Richard grabbed his arm. You will not breathe a word of this to anyone. Do you hear me? Kavanaugh pulled away, smirking. Or what, you'll protect him? You'll take down the company for a janitor. Richard didn't answer. The elevator doors opened and Miguel stepped out just as Kavanaugh brushed past him with a look of contempt. Miguel's eyes darted between them. He knew something had changed. That evening, as the office emptied, Richard found himself staring out the window again, the city glittering below. His phone buzzed, an anonymous message. No name, just one line. We know who he is. If you value your company, stay silent. A cold knot formed in his chest. The message was followed by an image attachment. Miguel captured on security footage entering the building years ago. Beneath it, the words, "Next move decides his fate and yours." Richard closed the phone slowly, the reflection of the city lights flickering in his eyes. He turned toward the dark hallway where somewhere below, Miguel was quietly finishing his shift, unaware that the ghosts of his past had finally found him. And for the first time in his career, Richard Harrington realized that saving a man might cost him everything he had ever built. The transformation, breaking the walls. Morning came heavy and colorless, the kind of gray that seeps into the bones. Richard Harrington barely slept. The message still burned behind his eyelids. We know who he is. Every instinct from his corporate life told him to protect the company, to distance himself from Miguel before the scandal exploded. But something deeper, something long dormant, refused to let him walk away. At 8 sharp, he arrived at headquarters. The mood was strange. Whispers followed him through the corridors, glances exchanged like passing storms. He knew why. Kavanaugh had started talking. The rumors had spread like wildfire. The CEO's pet janitor is a fugitive. When Richard entered the boardroom, the tension was already thick. The directors sat stiffly around the long glass table, their faces a mix of outrage and fear. You've compromised us, Richard, Kavanaugh began, voice laced with triumph. You brought a man under international investigation into the most confidential negotiations we've ever had. Richard didn't flinch. I brought in someone who saved this company when you were ready to destroy it for profit. That man closed a deal worth $50 million. That man, Kavanaugh snapped, could bring law enforcement through those doors any minute. You've jeopardized everything we built. Richard looked around the room, at men who'd once followed him without question, now sitting in judgment. You built nothing, he said quietly. You inherited a machine that eats people and spits them out. Maybe it's time it tasted its own medicine. A murmur rippled through the board. Are you defending him? Someone demanded. I'm defending truth, Richard said, and I won't let this company destroy another man's life because it's convenient. Kavanaugh slammed his hand on the table. Then you leave us no choice. The board is calling an emergency vote of confidence. Step down or we go public with everything. His record, your involvement, the deal. By noon it's done, Richard stared at him. You'd ruin a man over something you don't even understand. Kavanaugh's smile was thin. No, Richard. I'd ruin you. He's just collateral. The meeting ended with cold silence. As the others filed out, Richard remained seated, fingers pressed against his temples. His empire was slipping away, and yet for the first time, he didn't feel afraid of losing it, only of what it would mean if he didn't act. Downstairs, Miguel was finishing his rounds, unaware of the storm above. When Richard found him, he was cleaning the marble lobby, headphones on, humming softly. We need to talk, Richard said. Miguel removed the headphones, sensing the weight in his tone. What happened? They know, Richard said simply. About your past. About everything, Miguel went still. His face didn't change, but his eyes darkened, the calm replaced by resignation. Then it's over, he murmured. No, Richard said firmly. Not this time. Miguel shook his head. You don't understand. I've lived this before. When powerful men find a convenient enemy, they don't stop until he's gone. They don't care about truth, only protection. Then let's give them something they can't control, Richard said. You're not running anymore. You're going to face it. Miguel looked at him, half stunned, half angry. Face it with what? A mop and a prayer? With the truth, Richard said. And my voice beside yours. For a long moment, Miguel said nothing. Then he exhaled, the sound of decades collapsing into one breath. "You're a fool," he said softly. "Probably," Richard replied. "But for once, it feels like the right kind." By noon, the board meeting reconvened, this time in front of the company's senior staff. The press had already caught wind of something big. Cameras lined the hallway. As Richard entered with Miguel beside him, whispers erupted. The janitor walking next to the CEO was a sight no one could comprehend. Kavanaugh rose dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've gathered to address a breach of trust. The man standing beside our CEO is under international suspicion. Mr. Harrington has refused to take action, and we believe his judgment is compromised." Richard stood silent until the murmurs peaked. Then he stepped forward, voice steady but burning with conviction. "Everything you just heard is true, except the part about compromise. The man beside me was accused, but he was never proven guilty. He lost his family, his name, and his country because people like us believed paperwork over humanity." He turned toward the stunned employees. "This company was built on ambition, but somewhere along the way we forgot compassion. Miguel Alvarez, or Mikhail Androv, speaks 9 languages, but his silence has spoken louder than all of us combined. I'm not firing him. I'm promoting him to Director of Global Communications." The room erupted, gasps, outrage, disbelief. Reporters outside began shouting questions. Kavanaugh shot to his feet, red with fury. "You can't do this. The board won't allow it." Richard met his eyes coldly. "Then fire me." Kavanaugh opened his mouth, but before he could speak, a voice at the doorway cut through the chaos. "Excuse me, gentlemen." 2 figures entered. Federal agents, badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. The room fell silent. One of them looked at Miguel. "Mr. Androv, we've received new information regarding your case. We'd like to speak privately." Miguel's face turned pale. Richard stepped forward. "What kind of information?" The agent hesitated. "The charges have been under review for years. A new witness has come forward, one who confirms Mr. Androv was framed." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Kavanaugh's smirk vanished. Richard turned slowly toward him. "Looks like the truth just walked through the door." Miguel's legs almost gave out. Richard caught his arm, steadying him. For a moment, 2 men from different worlds stood side by side, one stripped of power, the other of freedom, both finally finding meaning in each other's fight. As the agents escorted Miguel away to finalize his statement, he turned back toward Richard. "You didn't have to do this." Richard's voice trembled but held firm. "Maybe not. But some debts aren't financial, Miguel. They're moral." The doors closed, leaving the boardroom in stunned silence. And though the company's future was uncertain, Richard felt something he hadn't in decades. Peace. He'd just gambled his legacy to save another man's name. Outside, rain began again, soft this time, cleansing rather than furious. But beneath that calm, Richard knew the real storm wasn't over yet. The truth had surfaced, but the reckoning was still to come. And somewhere deep inside, he sensed the final twist waiting, the one that would change both their lives forever. The legacy, the ending that stuns the office and heals the soul. The news broke 3 days later, and it spread faster than Richard could have imagined. Every major network ran the story. Fugitive linguist cleared after 12 years. CEO's faith changes everything. Miguel's face, once hidden in shadows, now filled television screens around the world. His voice, calm and sincere, told a truth that had waited over a decade to be heard. The new witness, a former intelligence officer, had confessed that evidence against Miguel was forged to protect corrupt politicians who profited from the war. Miguel Androv had never been a traitor. He had been a scapegoat. Harrington Global became the unexpected epicenter of redemption. Reporters filled the lobby, employees whispered with a mixture of awe and disbelief, and the man who once mopped the floors now walked the halls with the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing left to prove. Yet amid the chaos, Miguel didn't celebrate. Freedom, after all, felt strange when bought with years of silence. Richard watched from his office as Miguel adjusted to the strange fame. Invitations from universities, global conferences, and humanitarian organizations flooded in, but Miguel refused most of them. "The world already talks too much," he told Richard with a faint smile. "Sometimes silence says more." Richard laughed, but beneath that laugh was exhaustion. He had faced the board's wrath, the media's scrutiny, and his own reckoning. Shareholders demanded answers, but public sympathy for Miguel turned the tide. Donations poured into a new initiative Richard quietly launched, the Androff Foundation, dedicated to language education for refugee children. For once, the company's name was tied not to power but to purpose. Still, one thing unsettled Miguel. "They believe me now," he told Richard one evening as they watched the sunset over the city. "But my wife and son, they never saw the truth. I don't even know where they are." His voice broke slightly, the first crack Richard had ever heard. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "Then we'll find them." Weeks passed and the investigation deepened. With Interpol's cooperation, fragments of Miguel's old life began to reappear. Fragments of letters, records, even a refugee list from the early war years. And then one morning, Richard received a call that froze him in place. A humanitarian group in Poland had located a woman named Elena Androff, alive, teaching languages to displaced children. Her son David, now grown, was with her. They had lived believing Miguel had died years ago. Richard didn't tell Miguel right away. He wanted to be certain. But that afternoon, as Miguel stepped into his office, Richard simply handed him the phone. "There's someone who wants to speak to you," he said softly. Miguel's hands trembled as he lifted it to his ear. "Hello?" A pause. Then a woman's sob, fragile and disbelieving. "Mikhail?" He closed his eyes, a single tear sliding down his cheek. For the first time in years, his voice faltered. "Elena, it's me." The room fell silent except for the sound of quiet weeping. Richard turned away to give him privacy, but his own throat tightened. In all his years of chasing profit, he had never witnessed something this pure. A man's soul coming home through the wire of a phone call. The reunion happened weeks later in a small airport outside Warsaw. Richard insisted on accompanying him. When Miguel stepped off the plane, Elena was already there. Older, thinner, but unmistakably her. She ran to him and the years melted away. David, now a young man, stood a few steps behind, unsure until Miguel dropped to his knees and opened his arms. "My son," he whispered. The boy hesitated only a moment before collapsing into his father's embrace. Reporters captured the moment, but for once, the world fell silent. Some stories didn't need narration. They simply needed witnesses. Back in New York, Harrington Global transformed. Miguel's foundation grew rapidly, partnering with schools and NGOs around the world. He refused any salary, insisting every cent go toward teaching children the gift that had both cursed and saved him: language. Richard watched proudly, though he himself had begun to slow down. Months later, in the quiet of his office, Richard sat writing a letter, his resignation. He had decided to retire and dedicate his remaining years to the foundation. As he finished, his hand paused over the final line. He smiled faintly, wrote one more sentence, and sealed it in an envelope addressed to Miguel. The next morning, the office was unusually still. Richard Harrington had passed away in his sleep. Peaceful, serene, the kind of ending he had never believed he deserved. The letter was found on his desk. Miguel opened it at sunset, standing by the same window where Richard once watched the storms roll across the city. The letter read, "My friend, you taught me that power means nothing if it doesn't lift another soul. You helped me remember that truth isn't spoken in boardrooms, but in the quiet courage of those who refuse to be erased. I've built empires, but you built something greater: forgiveness. Carry it forward." Our tears welled in Miguel's eyes as he folded the letter gently. The next week, he delivered a speech at the United Nations, standing before diplomats, educators, and journalists. His voice was calm, resonant, alive. "In war, I lost my name. In silence, I lost my voice. But in kindness, I found both again. There is a language that transcends every border: compassion. Learn it, teach it, live it." The audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. But Miguel only looked upward, whispering softly in 9 languages, a prayer for the man who had believed in him when the world would not. Later that year, a new building opened, the Harrington Androff Center for Global Understanding, its marble entrance engraved with a single line: "The truest power lies not in wealth or words, but in the courage to listen," and in the gentle hum of children's laughter echoing through the halls in French, Swahili, Japanese, and countless other tongues. Miguel found what he'd been searching for all along. Not justice, not revenge, but peace.